Hi, I'm Kate Donahue, and I'm going to be presenting joint work with Sol and Barocas entitled Better Together, How Externalities of Size Complicate Notions of Solidarity and Actuarial Fairness. So let's start out with a motivating example. Consider the case of car insurance, and say that we're going to assume each person is either low risk or high risk. And you can imagine this diagram on the right, where the blue cars represent people who are low risk, and the red cars represent people who are higher risk. And they go to some insurance company that calculates the break-even amount of money that needs to be collected in order to offer insurance to this entire pool. So the question is, how should the total burden of premiums be divided among policyholders? There are a variety of options. You could consider splitting the costs evenly. You could also consider charging riskier policyholders more. And there are multiple goals here. One is fairness, for multiple possible definitions of fairness. Another is stability. You might want to incentivize all of the members to stay in the insurance pool as opposed to splitting off and forming smaller insurance pools. Let's make this a little more concrete. Say that there are 500 people who are lower risk and 500 people who are higher risk, and they have 2% chance of suffering a loss and 2.5% chance of suffering a loss, respectively, per time period. And each person is trying to insure a good of value $1,000. Let's assume to start out with that the total premiums needed in an insurance pool is given by the expected value of losses in that insurance pool. So first we can think of, suppose that the low risk group and the high risk group are in separate insurance pools. The expected value in the low risk group is going to be $20 per person, so that's the amount that they will be charged, and the amount in the high risk person is going to be $40 per person. Right? The total amount of premiums collected among both of the groups is $30,000 collectively. Next, let's assume that we combine the low risk and the high risk groups together to form a single insurance pool. The total amount that needs to be collected is still $30,000 because it's given by the expected value of losses. And let's say in the first case, we decide to split costs evenly among all members in the insurance pool. So everybody pays $30. This means that the low risk members see their cost increase by being pooled together and with this pricing scheme, and the high-risk members see their costs decrease. Another pricing scheme could be to price proportional to risk. In this case, this would work out that you could charge the low-risk members $20 per person, you could charge the high-risk members $40 per person, and have them still be pooled together. And you could also have a variety of different ways of pricing them. But sort of a common theme for this situation is that it's zero sum. Giving a lower cost to one person means that you have to give a higher cost to somebody else. And this is because it's a linear cost function given by the expected value method of calculating premiums. So for a set S of people, this cost of insuring the entire set is equal to the cost of insuring each person individually. However, this isn't the only type of pricing scheme, this only type of cost function we could have. We might consider the case where there are strict benefits to pooling, and we're calling this externalities of size. So the cost to insuring a sort of set of people S is strictly less than the sum of costs of insuring each person individually. And we're going to see that this complicates notions of fairness. And this work thinks about how does externalities of size affect questions around fairness. And just want to emphasize that fairness and stability are well studied in an insurance context, in economics and law and public policy, but they're largely premised on the notion of expected cost as an overall cost function. By contrast, cooperative game theory literature on fair division and stability does include externalities of size as a notion, but it mostly focuses on charging higher cost players more, not necessarily the notion of subsidization of higher cost members that we might think about here. So in this work, we use insurance as a case study. We consider externalities of size, which is absent from fairness discussions in insurance, but is a natural byproduct of risk pooling. And we see that this creates sort of important and counterintuitive dynamics. Insurance highlights these effects, but all of our theoretical results apply more broadly. We mostly use this as an illustrative case study. So here's an overall result of what we're going to talk through. I'll start out with a literature review, then discuss our model, and then I'll go over the impact of our model on two different sort of veins of thought in this insurance fairness situation. So first I'll start out with the literature review. We'll think of the key question: if people have differing levels of risk, should they pay the same in premiums? So actuarial fairness would say no, that each person should pay their own way. They should pay a price that's based only on their own sort of the risk level, not necessarily the risk level or the presence or absence of other people in the insurance pool. And this view says that differential pricing based on risk is necessary for a few reasons. One could be adverse selection, that lower risk policyholders should be incentivized to stay in the insurance pool. And by charging lower costs, you're doing so. You're making this happen. Another is moral hazard, that policyholders should be incentivized to avoid reckless behavior. And so charging people with higher risks more causes this to happen. And the last possible notion is some sort of notion of fairness, the belief that people with a lower risk should not pay more for to subsidize people with a higher risk. And this is one potential belief that people have. A sort of alternate notion is the notion of solidarity. And this is, again, if you ask the question, should people with differing level of risks pay the same in premium? Solidarity said maybe yes, that you should spread the cost of misfortune across the group, that prices should be the same or potentially more close than actuarially fair pricing would suggest. And this view is that it's not fair to price people more for bad luck, including the bad luck of being at a higher risk. So as an example, someone who drives an older car may genuinely be at a higher risk of damages, but they may drive an older car because of their income or wealth, which are factors that are largely outside of their control. So we may not want to penalize them for this misfortune of being at a higher risk. So both discussions tend to assume expected value notions of premium, which, as we saw before, gives linear costs. However, there are multiple reasons for, in insurance, externalities of size. One could be sort of administrative costs, for example. In this case, we use insolvency-based pricing, which is a premium calculation method that involves the standard deviation of losses. This gives us our externalities of size. But more broadly, all of our results hold for any submodular cost function. Let's discuss insolvency-based pricing a little more. So the amount of claims in any given time period is a random variable. You can see this curve below. And the expected value is given in the line here. And if you charge the expected value, you might run a risk that in any particular given year, you would have claims that would be much more or much less than the expected value, the amount you charge. This could have the risk of insolvency. The company would not have enough money to pay out the claims that have been incurred. And this could potentially, it could hurt the company. It could also hurt people who are making claims if their losses aren't compensated. One alternate pricing scheme could say that you should collect premiums up to some safety factor, up to, say, 97 percentile of the amount of claims that you could get in any given year. And this will reduce the chance of insolvency. In this case, larger pools have more tightly clustered distributions, so a smaller amount of cushion is needed. And this is sort of the mechanism by which larger pools are, in sum, cheaper to insure. We go into more detail in this in the paper. But next, let's discuss some of the model. We assume that there's a fixed number of people and a fixed level of risk. We discuss these as well more in the paper. And let's say that there are N sub L low-risk policyholders with risk R sub L, and N sub H high-risk policyholders with risk R sub H. And again, just visualize the blue cars and the red cars on the right. And we've got some fixed cost function for the insurance company that's a function of the number and risk of the policyholders in the pool. This we're going to assume is using our insolvency-based pricing function, but you could substitute it for anything else. We also have a notion of stability. And this is an existing notion. We say that an insurance pool is core stable if there doesn't exist a group of policyholders that all wishes to deviate and form their own subgroup. So in this example on the right, say if you might ask, does the set of all of the low-cost policyholders want to form their own subgroup? Would they get lower cost there? But this could be some homogeneous or heterogeneous mix. It could be some low-cost players and some higher-cost players. And the reason why we care about instability is that it could be motivated by potential market competition. And this might be something we want to protect against. But we want to emphasize that just because an arrangement is unstable doesn't mean that it's bad in some way. It just might mean that a non-market mechanism for achieving this goal might be better suited. Next, let's think about the impact of this model on solidarity. So before, this is the exact same table as before. We had the splitting cost with expected value premiums, and that splitting cost was a zero-sum game. Now let's think about externalities of size in this situation. And we see that with externalities of size, evenly splitting costs can financially benefit the lower risk group as well as the higher risk one. So this first row, I'll walk you through this table, gives the cost of insurance with the insolvency-based premium calculations when the low risk and high risk members are in different insurance pools. And the next row gives the cost when we pool them together and then split costs evenly. So first note that the total amount of costs strictly decreases. This is because of this sort of benefits the reduction of variability as we discussed earlier with this pricing scheme. And next, you should see that the high-risk members see their costs decrease when they're pooled together and costs are split evenly, but so does the low-risk members. They see their costs decrease from about $32 to $31. And this is because sort of the benefits of being in a larger pool are outweighing the costs of having to split their prices evenly with this higher risk group. And this lemma sort of formalizes these notions. It says that evenly splitting costs makes the grand coalition, the core group everybody together, be core stable, so long as the average cost in the pooled group is lower than the average cost for the low risk policyholders alone. And this is what the equation is saying. So it should be obvious why this is necessary for core stability. If this inequality is violated, then the lower cost group will have an incentive always to deviate. But it's interesting why this is sufficient. What this is basically saying is that if the lowest cost group in the blue cars in the example here, if we can guarantee that they don't want to split off, then any other arrangement of groups, players also doesn't want to split off. So for example, this set of the 2 blue and the 1 red car. So this sort of leads to a next question of what is the most that we can subsidize the high risk group before we incentivize the low risk group to leave? And the answer is given by this max subsidy pricing, which is defined below. In this pricing scheme, for a set of a pool, you will charge the lowest policyholders the price they would get if they were in a pool of only low-risk policyholders. And then you divide the remaining marginal cost among the higher risk policyholders. So let's look through our example here, what this looks like. This is the last row in this table here. You can see that the low-risk members are being charged exactly what they would be paying if they were by themselves, so no high-risk people involved at all. And the high-risk members, we calculate their price simply by saying what we need to charge them in order to make up the difference for the total that needs to be calculated. And this is kind of interesting because you can see that in this situation, the high-risk members are actually being charged strictly less than what the low-risk members are being charged. And we get an interesting result that with this pricing scheme, when everybody's in the same insurance pool, this is still core stable. So there does not exist a group of players that all wishes to defect if we commit to this pricing scheme. What's interesting is that this sort of sketches out the space of possible pricing options we can give to people. And it tells us that if we want to be as generous as possible, for some situations, we may wish to have this very generous pricing scheme. This could be possible. So overall, the implications for solidarity is that externalities of size provide some wiggle room that allows us to subsidize the higher risk group, and that this can still offer some incentives for participation of the lower risk group. It is possible to have very high levels of subsidization that causes instability, but you can subsidize even more than this even split pricing. Next, let's think about the impact on actuarial fairness. So let's think of what potential goals we could have for actuarial fairness. 2 very strong goals could be efficiency. We want the total amount of premiums charged to sum up to the amount needed. Another goal could be that the prices are independent of the number and risk of other people. So this is very much, I want to be charged something based solely on my identity. I don't care how many other people there are. I don't care what their risk level is. So unsurprisingly, when you have strict submodularity, you can't achieve both of these properties. And the way you should think about this is that if prices are truly independent of the number and risk of other people, then the low-risk people must be charged the price that they would be given if the high-risk people completely left, if they were in separate pools. But if every person is charged the amount they would get if they were in a separate pool, this must imply inefficiency because we have strict submodularity, so there are strict benefits to pooling. So this sort of strict goals aren't achievable. Let's see if we can have some weaker goals of aligned incentives. We're going to keep our efficiency goal. We're going to have some goal of stability, that the low risk and the high risk groups don't wish to defect. They sort of won't get strictly lower prices by defecting. And then let's also say that we want some sort of aligned incentives. So say you want this pro-social incentive that people prefer that their partners are less risky. And this is some desirable pricing scheme, desirable property you might want. We surprisingly get this result that you actually can't achieve these 3 properties simultaneously. And we'll show this by walking through an example. So if you have 2 of these, you must mean that you can't have the third. Here we'll assume we have efficiency and stability, and then show how incentives might not be aligned. And in this example here, we have proportional pricing. We go more in detail this in the paper, but basically it's a pricing scheme that is both efficient and is stable. And we'll show that in this case can have cases there could be perverse incentives. So let's think of the proportional pricing scheme where the high-risk members have risk 2.5%. And this table shows the total amount that's needed and the low risk and high risk prices in this pricing scheme. And next, let's look at the amount that the high and low risk people are charged when the risk of the higher risk group increases to 4%. Note that the lower risk members see their price strictly decrease. So they have this antisocial incentive of being happier when other people are more high risk. And this is potentially undesirable in a pricing scheme. So now let's think, can we have even weaker goals? Say that we just want the lowest policyholders to be ambivalent about how risky their partners are. We don't want them to be have a pro-social incentive, they just don't care. It turns out that this is possible to achieve this weaker version. And you can think, what pricing scheme satisfies these goals? You might think about, say, let's charge the lower risk policyholders some fixed amounts, and then have high risk policyholders make up the difference. And we'll say that this might satisfy these desirable goals. So this should sound familiar because this is exactly the solidaristic max subsidy pricing scheme we were discussing before. This is back in the solidaristic case. We're charging the low risk policyholders the same price that they would get if they were by themselves in a group of only low risk policyholders. And then we have the high risk policyholders make up the difference for what's needed for the total. And this is just an example showing this of this pricing scheme. And so this is sort of interesting. We started with this sort of actuarially fair goal, and we ended up with this solidaristic pricing scheme. So implications for actuarial fairness is that we might need to revisit the conceptual goals for actuarial fairness. What are the properties you want? Can we achieve any of them? And basically the goal is, how should we divide these benefits? What is a way that is fair? So let's think about the broader implications. So those high-level summary is that externalities of size complicates notions of traditional fairness in insurance. It helps to align the goals of low and high-risk groups and provides more ability to subsidize them. But it also means that certain sort of arrangements of properties are undesirable or impossible, especially for achieving actuarially fair goals. But our findings have broader implications for the FAccT community beyond just insurance and scarce resource allocation. Basically, the gist of what we're trying to say is that how we decide to treat one individual often depends on how we decided to treat others. And this creates new opportunities and new challenges for how you might want to think about and reason about fairness. For more information, please read our full paper or come talk to us in the Q&A. Thanks.